Mr. Magaziner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. You know, when people ask me how it is serving in Congress, I usually say it's pretty good. You know, the people are nice, and it's not always as partisan as the media would have you believe. We do work together sometimes. But then there are days like this when some of my colleagues are attacking the Endangered Species Act. The Endangered Species Act, which has saved some of our country's most iconic symbols, from the bald eagle to the American alligator, multiple species that have been protected by this act. The Endangered Species Act works. 99% of species listed have avoided extinction, as we just heard. And this historic anniversary of the act should also remind us not only of the progress that we've made, but of our need to continue to modernize the Endangered Species Act to align with the realities of climate change and the need to preserve funding in order to actually enforce and implement measures to save our most vulnerable species. Protections under the Environmental Species Act are premised on strong federal-state partnerships, and this is important. We've seen this in our home state of Rhode Island. The orange American burying beetle, one of nature's most efficient composters, once thrived across 35 U.S. states, virtually disappeared during the 20th century, and Block Island, Rhode Island, in my district, was one of the few remaining refuges left. But thanks to the Endangered Species Act, the beetle is now being reintroduced in its former range, and that is just one example. In Rhode Island, the piping plover population is rebounding as well. The number of nesting pairs of the piping plover population has increased 9-fold since 1986, when it was listed. We've heard already about the bald eagle population, which reached nationwide lows of 487 nesting pairs, only 487 in 1963, and have now rebounded dramatically and are back in Rhode Island. That is just another unquestionable Endangered Species Act success. And as a result, the bald eagle was federally delisted in 2007. There is still a risk that climate change will stall the progress we have made, and so we need to update our tools to act on climate change's adverse impacts on species and their habitats. And we see this in Rhode Island, we see it all across the country. Rising sea levels, beach erosion, warming temperatures are threatening numerous species of birds, fish, and other wildlife, and also the Americans that make a living from fishing, including in my district. Climate change threatens them as well. So we do need to update the Endangered Species Act to account for climate risks, but unfortunately, some of my colleagues are trying to move in the opposite direction and water down the ESA and cut the funding that we need to enforce it. And I always think it's important that we not paint with a broad brush, again, because we don't want to be partisan. And I know that many of my colleagues on the other side believe in the Endangered Species Act and don't want to see it watered down. But there are some who, I swear, if there were 5 animals left in a given species, would want to shoot 4 of them and pat themselves on the back for saving the 5th. And we have to move away from that. So, for the sake of vulnerable species impacted by climate change, and also to protect coastal communities like those I represent, we need to support the thousands of people who are working and living in coastal communities who need healthy fish and animal populations, including in order to make a living. Now, Ms. Coit, can you just talk a little bit about how NOAA Fisheries is integrating climate change considerations into the policies that you're putting forward?
Certainly. Thank you for that question. As you mentioned, climate change is negatively affecting threatened and endangered species, and the marine heat waves that we're seeing are particularly serious when it comes to coral reefs and some of our productive habitats. So we are required to make decisions based on the best available science. So we're taking a look at the climate change impacts to the ecosystems and the habitats as part of our decision making. And we're working on things like the Climate Ecosystem Fisheries Initiative to try to both expand our scientific understanding and do a better job of predicting. Mr. Ash mentioned the loss of sea ice, predicting what's going to happen so that we can make sure that we make decisions that are appropriate for conservation.
And quickly, as we head into appropriation season, can you just speak to the importance of sufficient resources to enforce the act?
Yes, without the resources, from the listing decisions to the recovery plans to the consultations that are needed for the projects that support our infrastructure, we're not able to do our jobs. So we need sufficient funding if we're going to succeed in implementing the Endangered Species Act in a way that's going to promote conservation of species and also the economic objectives of this country.
Thank you. I yield back.
Councilwoman Hageman is recognized.